This was perhaps the most vital, significant, and vitally important legislation in higher education in living memory.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Professor Abhishek Saha says Britain's universities need the passing of the Higher Education Act.
When an academic or a visiting speaker or someone in the university expresses an opinion that goes against this dominant narrative, there is often a backlash and there are attempts to silence them. And what you would like universities to do in such situations is to stand up for their own and to back the free speech and academic freedom, but they have not been doing that.
Abhishek says the universities are losing their free speech foundation.
Over the past decade or so, we have seen increasing number of instances where academics have been hounded, cancelled, or even fired from their jobs.
And that cancel culture is having a chilling effect on academia.
When they see prominent people being cancelled or fired for their expression of these views, it is natural for them to self-censor to avoid hurting their promotion prospects. But I think it is devastating for society as a whole.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Abhishek Saha, Professor of Maths and founder member of the London University's Council for Academic Freedom. Abhishek, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
You start by telling us why academic freedom is important, not just for you, the academic, but more widely.
Academic freedom is the freedom of the individual academic to investigate and publish and teach in accordance with his or her intellectual convictions. So academic freedom, properly codified, ensures that academics can express controversial opinions and teach and write about their subjects without facing the risk of getting fired from their jobs or their promotion prospects being negatively affected. So academic freedom is closely related to free speech, but it's more limited in scope because it applies to academics and it comes with additional safeguards. And that brings me to why is academic freedom important. And the reason, I think, is that the core value, the ultimate purpose of academia and universities is the pursuit of knowledge and truth. And this goal demands that academics should have the freedom to freely explore and express all ideas, including and especially ideas that may be controversial or heretical. And so academic freedom is predicated on the university as this unique and distinct community of scholars whose telos is the pursuit of truth. And the reason academic freedom is important for society is that without academic freedom, our progress in human knowledge will stall. So academic freedom is not there to give some special perks or perquisites for professors. It is there so that as a society, we can safeguard and pursue truth and rationality.
Under the previous government, we saw the introduction of this Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act.
Yes.
What were some of the freedom violations? Can you give some examples that led to this act being created?
Over the past decade or so, we have seen increasing number of instances where academics have been hounded, cancelled, or even fired from their jobs. And a background to this, I think, has been that in many universities there has been a dominant narrative around several controversial issues related to race, sex and gender, group differences, hot-button political issues, and so on. And this has been exacerbated by the ideological skew within our universities. So when an academic or a visiting speaker or someone in the university expresses an opinion that goes against this dominant narrative, there is often a backlash and there are attempts to silence them. And what you would like universities to do in such situations is to stand up for their own and to back the free speech and academic freedom, but they have not been doing that. Instead, they've often been siding against the cancellers, and we have seen lots of such prominent incidents. To give two examples, the postdoctoral scholar Noah Carl was fired by Cambridge in 2019 after a vicious mob there was a mobbing campaign against him for perfectly legal views he expressed, and his work, which was published in journals, perfectly reputable journals, And it was never found that he committed any ethical breaches like falsification of data, nothing like that, but merely there was guilt by association, that he had engaged in controversial research or communicated with controversial figures. And the other kind of example that we have seen many of are these gender critical scholars like Kathleen Stock and many others who have faced sustained harassment, masked protesters on campus, and physical intimidation, and universities have not given them the support they need. And these are just prominent cases, but they are the tip of the iceberg. And this leads to a wider chilling effect that often goes unnoticed because other academics self-censor when they see all this. And the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act was brought in partly as a reaction to all these things we were seeing. And I think it was a very important and necessary piece of legislation. It would have, for the first time, given enforcement mechanisms to enforce universities' free speech duties.
So you mentioned the self-censorship. Is that something you're seeing through academia now?
Yes, absolutely. So self-censorship is perhaps less noticeable because it does not make the news as is prominent cases of silencing or deplatforming, but it's rife as borne out by figures. Surveys have shown, I think a survey from about 5 years ago showed that over 70% of academics with minority views, such as conservative views or pro-Brexit views, which are minority in the universities, though not necessarily minority in the general population, they were self-censoring. And this kind of self-censorship is pervasive. It creates a wide chilling effect, and it's rational because academics, when they see prominent people being cancelled or fired for their expression of these views, it is natural for them to self-censor to avoid hurting their promotion prospects. But I think it is devastating for society as a whole because it prevents us from hearing these perspectives. And it often operates as a perpetual machine. So there's an interesting study that I think is very important that recently came out, which surveyed psychology professors in US universities about these taboo conclusions, things that are that the dominant narrative says there is a disciplinary consensus against these taboo conclusions. These are on topics such as race and sex and gender and so on. So when surveyed, it found out that there is actually no consensus. Oh. The experts remain privately divided. They're all over the place. But in public, they self-censor their true opinions. And this leads to an impression of consensus, which facilitates the continued censorship and self-censorship of those holding such views. So it just kind of operates, it's like self-sustaining, and that's bad for us as a society because we only see one side of the picture and it distorts the academic record.
I mean, critics of all this say that you're engaging in this kind of moral panic. I mean, what would you say to that?
First of all, that it's not a moral panic is borne out by figures that, for example, FIRE, perhaps the world's leading organization now against censorship and for free expression, a US-based organization, has found out that the number of instances of academics being cancelled or fired in the last 10 years is historically at the highest level since records began. It is worse than the McCarthy era of the 50s. So it's, as a plain matter of fact, not true. But also those who say that we are engaging in a moral panic are often the people who, whose views are the orthodoxy. So if your views are in line with the dominant narratives, university intellectual life can feel unrestricted. So that's what's kind of going on. And a final point that I think that's worth making here is that many of these people who say that it's a moral panic often also say that academic freedom is unrelated to free speech and it requires some special qualifying criteria around the expertise of the academic or the quality of the contested work. And I think this is a tool for gatekeeping. So what the people making these arguments are often they view others' free speech as an obstacle, but also they see their own academic freedom and employment protections as essential. And so, by making these kind of arguments, they want to make sure that their own groupthink, dogma, and conformity win.
I wanted to look at a couple of the changes the Act will bring.
Yeah.
So one is this compensation for staff, students and visitors who may be cancelled on campus. I mean, we hear occasionally in the media about cancellation, but it's hard to know how much of an issue this is.
So cancel culture, I think, is a huge issue. And we have, for example, there is the Academics for Academic Freedom banned list that records all these incidents of cancellation. And it has, and if the banned list is available on the internet, you can just go to their website, and it records literally hundreds of instances in the last few years where academics and students and visiting speakers have been cancelled for expressing perfectly lawful views. But even these instances of cancellations that are recorded are just the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of cases where people are cancelled don't even make the news because there is some procedure going on, and then there are policies around not disclosing internal process. So they're just the tip of the iceberg. And I think cancel culture is obviously very bad for the person being cancelled. It can be devastating for their career and so on. But a point I tried to make previously is that it's also bad for us as a society. And I want to go back here to John Stuart Mill, who in his famous essay on liberty said that for the pursuit of truth, we need to have the freedom to express all opinions, both true and false, because the silencing of an opinion robs all of us. And that is because, well, if the opinion is true, then hearing it allows us to exchange error for truth. But even if the opinion expressed is false or offensive or so on, as many cancellers would want such opinions not to be shared, but even then it helps our pursuit of truth, because the collision with error allows us to more clearly see why what we believe is true. So we need this debate. And finally, as often happens, when these contested opinions that people want cancelled are only partly true and partly false, because no one really has a monopoly on every truth. And then we need these controversial points of view to supply the remainder of the truth. So cancel culture, I think, is not just bad for academics and for freedom of speech, but it's bad for epistemology, for our, as a society, how we know what is true and how we pursue truth and knowledge.
Another thing the Act brings in is this protection against foreign interference in universities.
Yes.
That's strengthened. Yeah, how does this manifest? What is foreign interference in universities?
Right. This is a great question. So part of it is how the economics of universities has worked out, especially over the last few years, where universities have become increasingly dependent on overseas fee-paying students. And many of the students who are coming here are from more authoritarian countries, such as China, which is the top sending country, with, I think, about 150,000 students who came from China, according to records from 2022. So the Chinese students who come here, and as well as students from other authoritarian countries, are often under close watch from their security services. And the Chinese Communist Party has become increasingly concerned about the discourse around China in UK universities and its influence in what is said or not said in UK universities has grown over the years. So you have students being censored by other Chinese students, embassies keeping a watch, and so on. And the real problem is that universities have not done anything about the problem because of their financial dependencies. In fact, in many cases, their reflexive reaction has been to further curtail the free speech and academic freedom at UK universities. And we have seen many examples of this. For example, we have seen the example of my LUCAF colleague, Michelle Shipworth, whose course was taken away from her. We have seen an example of a professor in Nottingham who was prevented from having an event with a Taiwanese politician because it might affect overseas arrangements, and so on. And now what this act would have done, it would have pushed back against this interference with free speech and academic freedom in at least three ways. So the duty of the act to secure free speech and academic freedom would mean, as pointed out by the OFS guidance which came out in March, that universities would need to support their staff on UK campuses, even if doing so upsets their foreign partnerships. So it might mean that in certain cases, universities might need to make statements of support for their UK employees, even if it offends someone in China. The second way it would have helped is that there was a duty to promote the importance of freedom of speech, to actively promote. And this would have allowed, for example, Chinese students in the UK to become more aware of their free speech and academic freedom rights. And the last way this would have helped the situation is that it created a new duty of the Office for Students, the regulator, to monitor the overseas funding arrangements of UK universities, and that would have given it new powers to ensure that these overseas partnerships do not negatively affect academic freedom of UK universities. So obviously with the Act now paused, the future of these checks are unclear.
So Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson, as you mentioned, has paused the Act. She said it's treating universities like a political battlefield, and the legislation exposes some students to harm. What would you say to that?
Right. So she made these statements shortly after pausing the Act, and she has also talked about this political battlefield thing before that. To me, these statements are perplexing because, first of all, the Freedom of Speech Act operated within the existing legal framework. So it only protected free speech and academic freedom within the law. And there is a plethora of UK legislation against harmful or hate speech or so on. And nothing in the Act would have made any previously illegal speech legal. So the Act did not materially change what was protected. It gave new enforcement mechanisms to ensure that these rights were upheld. So that's one point. The other point is that if the history of free speech teaches us anything, it is that minority groups are often the ones who most benefit from free speech and academic freedom. In the civil rights in the US, we saw how free speech was key to getting these freedoms and rights, civil rights. So to say that it would harm minority groups, as Bridget Phillipson did, for example, she mentioned Jewish groups and other groups, is completely false, in my opinion. The last point is that when Bridget Phillipson talks about universities being a public good, not a political battlefield for culture wars, she's absolutely right. But to ensure that universities are treated as a public good, the public needs to have trust in universities. And to do that, universities have to remain apolitical and respect free speech and academic freedom. So what this Act would have done would ensure that public regains trust. Instead, I think by pausing the Act, Bridget Phillipson has, at least temporarily, destroyed the best chance of that happening. And this, to me, is treating universities like a political battlefield.
In terms of this political side of things, the Act is often painted as this kind of Tory far-right agenda. Yes. Most of the academics I've spoken to who support it are kind of proudly left. How should we understand this politicisation of the Act?
Yes, this has been quite unfortunate because this politicization of this Act has meant that many academics who are perhaps maybe not so aware of what the Act does, would reflexively oppose it because it was brought in by the Tories and they're from the left. But the point is that, first of all, an Act should be judged by its content and its consequences, not by who brought it in, because that is just guilt by association. It's a logical fallacy. This Act would have protected free speech and academic freedom for everyone. It is completely content neutral. It does not depend on what views are expressed. It does not lie on one side of politics or culture wars. It would protect us all, especially the powerless and the marginalized, including those of the left. So I think this is a terrible argument, and I hope that those who are making it should look at the Act and who it would protect, and look at what the Act actually does.
We know the Act's been paused. I think there's some legal action as well from the Free Speech Union. Yes. Can you tell us what the current situation is?
Right. So Bridget Phillipson paused the Act on 26th of July, just 6 days before its key provisions would have come into force. The key provisions being the complaints scheme, which would have allowed students, academics and visiting speakers to make a complaint to the Office for Students if their free speech rights were violated, and the statutory tort, which allowed people to go to court. So all these key provisions were paused by her just a few days before they were supposed to come into force. And it was clear from her initial statement that what she really wanted to do was to swiftly repeal the whole act. But since then, there have been some interesting developments. So throughout the rest of the summer, during the parliamentary recess, we had seen lots of articles coming out every week, often daily, pointing out holes in the government's arguments for pausing the act. And then we saw this open letter signed by over 600 academics, including, I believe, 7 Nobel laureates, saying that this is a vital act, this act needs to be activated as soon as possible. And I think partly due to all this outcry and also this action taken by the Free Speech Union, who are pursuing a judicial review against Bridget Phillipson's decision, and they have now gotten permission to proceed, and they are going to have a hearing on January 23rd of next year. So partly because of all this pushback, at the Department of Education and the ministers at some point perhaps decided to re-engage with academics and maybe see what they would do. So several representatives of academic freedom organizations, myself included, met these DFE officials in August, and later we met Jackie Smith, the Minister for Skills and Universities, in early September. And what I can say is that we made it very clear to them how vital the act is, and the fact that any slight improvements that we were seeing in the last few months in the academic freedom atmosphere at universities were purely due to the expectation of the act coming into force. It had focused the minds of university administrators, and this would be swiftly reversed if the act is repealed. And we really need this act. We need these new enforcement mechanisms. We need the complaint scheme, the statutory tort. In my view, as I made clear to them, and others also from other free speech organizations, this was perhaps the most vital, significant, and vitally important legislation in higher education in living memory.
I wanted to also ask you about the wider politicization of university life. I mean, you're a professor of maths. It's hard from an outside point of view to see how that gets politicized. But can you tell us how your everyday life will be affected by these things?
Yes. So I think over the last few years, we have seen increasing politicization of academia. And I think you make a good point about science and mathematics, which are more concerned with what one would view as objective truths or rational or rigorous arguments, less prone to politicization as perhaps the Department of Politics might be. So I think what is happening in science and maths is really interesting to understand what is happening in academia, because it's a test case to see what are the most pernicious threats to academic freedom and how politicization operates. So we have seen, as you mentioned, these efforts to decolonize mathematics. So this takes multiple forms. For example, one form is that we are being asked to emphasize certain aspects of mathematics history and de-emphasize others in our teaching. And that's really bizarre, because the history of mathematics has never actually been an essential part of the mathematics curriculum. And of course, academics can enliven their lessons by putting in snippets of history, but that should be in line with their own judgment and academic freedom. At its most extreme, decolonization can take forms such as we have seen in Australia, where the most prestigious Australian University's science department has now started a course in indigenous mathematics, where numbers and arithmetic are of secondary importance.
Really?
Yes. So I think these efforts to decolonize science and maths should be put into the bigger picture of the politicization of science and the related censorship and suppression of research findings. And on censorship, there was a very important paper which by 39 prominent scientists published recently that makes the first significant attempt to understand scientific censorship. And the most important finding from the paper is that censorship is often coming from fellow scientists. And the key motive of these censors are pro-social, meaning to avoid harm. And what helps this is that many criteria on what is published in scientific journals can be subjective. And this allows these censors and gatekeepers to make unreasonable demands to suppress the findings that go against their ideological agenda. For example, they might say that these experiments are not rigorous enough, but they would only say it for one side of the picture, not the other. So this distorts the scientific record. Of course, politicization of science is not entirely new. To give an example, in 1930s Russia, we saw how Lysenko denounced classical genetics as fascist science. And over 3,000 scientists in Russia in the 1930s were imprisoned, killed, or exiled. And the effect on food production and agriculture was devastating. And that's what happens when you politicize science. And today we are seeing this politicization of science and mathematics by ideology, sometimes called critical social justice or wokeness, one of whose planks is to replace the scientific method and the idea of merit as the key metric by things like multiple ways of knowing and alternative realities, essentially. And this is, first of all, this is contrary to the scientific mission, and it's also deeply misguided, in my opinion, even if it is partly motivated by a desire to help minority groups. It's very misguided for two reasons. First of all, there is very little evidence that any of this actually helps minority groups. For example, one of the things this politicization of science rests on is the idea of role models, that you need to have more role models who look like you. But there is not much evidence behind this role model theory. My own experience growing up in India was that I looked up to mathematicians who did great work, not based on if they looked like me. So that's one thing. The other is that, as Alan Sokal pointed out in a recent article, you cannot deduce an ought from an is. So just publishing some scientific facts, even if it is unpalatable, does not justify restricting the rights of minority groups. So valid ideas should not be suppressed because some might use them. We should instead push back against this misuse. The final point I want to make is that this kind of politicization of science and censorship of science leads to loss of trust in science and hurts us as a society. As I like this quote by Steve Stuart Williams, an evolutionary biologist, who has said that politicization and censorship of science prevents us from understanding the world. And by preventing us from better understanding the world, it prevents us from making the world a better place. And I think this is something that a lot of these people lose sight of.
It seems that the victims here are the students. I mean, you love maths, you sign up for the course, you want to learn maths, and suddenly you're learning history rather than maths.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we are really shortchanging our students here, and I think students will see through that. My own experience as a student was that when I was growing up in India, we saw these efforts from the more right-wing Indian government at the time to impose some version of Vedic mathematics in the school curriculum. And even as a school student, to me, it was clear that it was complete nonsense because, okay, Vedic mathematics is some collection of clever arithmetic tricks. It had its place at a certain time, but mathematics should be taught based on what is most useful for mathematics, not for how it fits in with our traditions and so on. But I think this is also interesting because it shows that attempts to politicize science or maths can come from the left or the right. The common factor is this kind of identity politics or identitarianism or traditions or whatever it is. And I think students will see through that, and it might even lead to a backlash. And I think we are seeing the first signs of that in some surveys, and that might be the silver lining here.
So if we don't stop this kind of diversity, equity, inclusion affecting our higher education, where do you think we would end up?
Yeah, so this diversity, equity, and inclusion has been one of the key factors behind this kind of suppression of academic freedom, this undermining of merit, and so on. And it comes in many ways. So one which I wrote about recently was this requirement of many academic candidates to demonstrate commitment to this kind of DEI or EDI causes. And to me, that is a form of compelled speech, because academics, you're kind of making them subscribe to a particular ideological agenda in order to get their jobs. So it's an obvious curtailment of academic freedom. And I think also there is, as I mentioned, there is very little evidence that any of this actually helps. So there is a place, perhaps, for this kind of EDI steps, but they need to be evidence-based. They need to respect academic freedom. They should be proportional and in line with the law. And we are not seeing any of that. And if we keep going down this path, I think it is increasingly hurting academic freedom, and as a result, as a consequence, it is hurting the idea of how we pursue knowledge and truth. It is hurting the concept of merit as a key metric for evaluating scientific findings. So it is contrary to the mission of universities. That is not to say that we should, of course, we should treat people equally, we should foster equal opportunity. But the point is that many of these EDI initiatives go far beyond that, and they come with this whole suite of assumptions and theories which are highly contested, which I mentioned before is sometimes called critical social justice, or the identity synthesis, or simply wokeness. And basically, when you subscribe to all of that and put that into universities, it politicizes academia. And that has many negative downstream consequences, as we have already discussed.
So how optimistic are you that we can fix this and rebuild a free speech culture in our universities?
Yeah, so free speech culture, I think, that's a very important point, because law and culture kind of work together. Of course, you need legal protections, but to ensure that these protections for academic freedom and free speech are sustained, you also need to build a free speech culture. Otherwise, as we are seeing, any laws can be repealed, and laws will not last and will not even be put forward if we don't have this underlying culture. So how do we build such a free speech culture? And this is something I've been thinking about, and a lot of people have a lot of great ideas, so I don't claim any originality in the suggestions I'm about to make. But I think there are 3 planks that we need to pursue. So we need to, first of all, do institutional reforms. And that means ensuring that our universities and other truth-seeking institutions maintain a degree of neutrality on these kind of contested topics that are not core to their mission of research and teaching. We need to reimagine this EDI so that it is respectful of academic freedom and evidence-based. We need to pursue, or we need to kind of revamp scientific or academic publishing so that it's more transparent and open and recommitted to its core mission of discourse of academics. So that's the institutional reforms. But we also need to build networks that promote this kind of free speech culture. So, for example, I'm this founder member, as you mentioned, of this organization, LUCAF. We have seen lots of this kind of organizations springing up, which allow people to network and maybe to put forward or to organize events that promote academic freedom and free speech. And not just that, but also various perspectives which don't get discussed. Related to that, I think we need to foster viewpoint diversity and promote anti-fragility in young people, because a lot of these problems, at least part of them, have come from this culture of safetyism that we have seen many young people, where you're unable to disagree well, where words are equated with violence. And I think we need a culture that pushes back against this, and for that we need this kind of social and cultural movement. But the last plank, I think, is individual actions that we can take. We need to engage with the government if needed, with our institutions. We need to write letters, we need to sit on committees, and we need to engage in principled advocacy. So we need to stay true to the principle that free speech protects everyone. So we should defend free speech and academic freedom for everyone, including those whose views we might personally disagree or loathe. I think that is really important. So I am optimistic that we can build a free speech culture. I think the last decade has seen a crisis of free speech and academic freedom, but to every action there is a reaction, and I believe that youth naturally rebels against this kind of stifling constraints, and we have seen in recent surveys of young people who are about to enter universities that they might be getting a bit tired of this kind of stifling orthodoxy on what can and cannot be said. So it may well be that cultural movement which is pro-truth and pro-free speech might be on its way. So there is some optimism, I think, that we can have there.
Abhishek Saha, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.